Everyone keeps asking me how I could have done such a thing, how I could have named my baby after my ex-boyfriend without telling my husband. They act like I planned it all along, like I was trying to hurt him on purpose. But that's not what happened. It was complicated and emotional, and I made a mistake that I didn't even realize was a mistake until it was too late. When I went into labor, Mark was so excited and supportive. He held my hand through every contraction and told me how proud he was of me. He kept talking about how excited he was to finally meet Noah and hold his son in his arms. The delivery was long and difficult, but when our son was finally born, he was perfect. 10 fingers, 10 toes, healthy lungs, and the most beautiful face I had ever seen. Mark was crying and saying how much he loved him already. Then the nurse came over to congratulate us and check the baby's identification bracelet. She looked at her chart and said how lovely it was to meet little Bennett. She said Bennett was such a handsome name for such a handsome baby. Mark's face went completely white. He looked confused and hurt and angry all at the same time. He asked what she meant by Bennett because we had named the baby Noah. The nurse looked confused and checked her paperwork again. She confirmed that the baby's name was listed as Bennett Mark, according to the birth certificate paperwork I had filled out. Mark turned to me with this look of complete betrayal and asked what was going on. Why was our son named Bennett instead of Noah like we had agreed? I tried to explain that I had changed my mind at the last minute, that Bennett just felt like the right name when I saw him, that sometimes mothers just know these things and have to trust their instincts about what's best for their babies. But Mark wasn't buying it. He asked me why I had chosen that specific name, if it was just a random last-minute decision or if there was more to it. I could see in his eyes that he already suspected the truth. I tried to lie and say it was just a name I had always liked. But Mark knows me too well, and he could tell I wasn't being completely honest. He kept pressing me for the real reason until I finally broke down and admitted that Bennett was my ex-boyfriend's name. The look on Mark's face was devastating. It was like I had slapped him or told him I was leaving him for another man. He couldn't believe that I had named our son after someone I used to date without even discussing it with him. He asked me if I was still in love with Bennett, if I had been in contact with him, if I wished he was the father of our baby instead of Mark. I tried to reassure him that none of those things were true, but I could tell he didn't believe me. Mark walked out of the hospital room without saying another word. He left me alone with our newborn son, crying and trying to figure out how to fix what I had just broken. The nurses kept asking if everything was okay, and I didn't know what to tell them. My husband Mark and I had been trying to have a baby for 2 years. We went through fertility treatments and miscarriages and so much heartbreak before I finally got pregnant with our son. Throughout the entire pregnancy, we argued about names constantly. Mark wanted traditional names and I wanted something more unique. We would spend hours looking through baby name books and websites, making lists and crossing things off. It became this ongoing negotiation that sometimes turned into real fights. Mark really wanted to name the baby after his grandfather, but I didn't love the name Robert. I suggested more modern names like Aiden or Logan, but he thought they were too trendy. We went back and forth for months without agreeing on anything. Finally, when I was about 7 months pregnant, we reached a compromise. We would name the baby Noah Elijah. Noah was a name we both liked, and Elijah was Mark's middle name. It felt like the perfect solution after months of disagreement. Mark was so excited about finally having a name picked out. He ordered a custom onesie with Noah embroidered on it. He bought a wooden nameplate for the nursery that said Noah's Room. He would talk to my belly and call the baby Noah. He was completely invested in that name. I was happy about it too, at first. Noah was a good name, and it felt like we had finally found something we could both agree on. I started thinking of the baby as Noah and imagining what he would look like. Everything seemed settled and peaceful, but then something happened that changed everything. About a week before my due date, I was going through old photos on my phone to make space for baby pictures. I came across some photos from college that I had forgotten about. Photos of me with my ex-boyfriend Bennett. Bennett and I had dated for 3 years in college. He was my first real love, and I thought we were going to get married someday. But after graduation, he got a job in another state and I stayed home. We tried long distance for a while, but it didn't work out. The breakup was devastating for me. Looking at those photos brought back so many memories and emotions. I remembered how much I had loved Bennett and how happy we had been together. I started thinking about what might have been if things had worked out differently between us. I found myself looking at his social media, even though I knew I shouldn't. He was married now with kids of his own. He looked happy and successful, and like he had built a good life for himself. I felt this strange mix of sadness and nostalgia and longing. Then I started thinking about his name, Bennett. I had always loved that name. It was strong and distinctive and had such good memories associated with it. When we were dating, I used to imagine naming our future children Bennett if we had a boy. Suddenly, the name Noah started feeling wrong to me. It felt generic and boring compared to Bennett. I couldn't stop thinking about how much I loved the name Bennett and how perfect it would be for my son. I told myself it was just because I liked the name itself, not because of my ex. That it was possible to separate the name from the person. That choosing Bennett didn't mean anything inappropriate or disloyal to Mark. But deep down, I knew that wasn't entirely true. The name meant something to me because of Bennett. It connected me to a part of my past that I had never fully let go of. It made me feel close to someone who had been incredibly important to me. I tried to push these thoughts away and focus on the name we had already chosen. But as my due date got closer, I couldn't stop thinking about Bennett. Not just the name, but the person. I found myself wondering if he ever thought about me and what our children might have looked like. I knew I was being ridiculous and emotional. I was happily married to Mark and we were about to have a baby together. I had no business thinking about my ex-boyfriend from college, but pregnancy hormones make you feel things more intensely, and I couldn't seem to control my thoughts. The day before I went into labor, I made a decision that I would regret for the rest of my life. I called the hospital and changed the name on our birth plan from Noah Elijah to Bennett Mark. I told myself it was just a small change and that Mark would understand once he got used to it. I convinced myself that the name Bennett felt right in my heart, and that was what mattered most. That intuition and maternal instinct were more important than the agreements Mark and I had made months earlier. My best friend Sarah tried to talk me out of it when I told her what I was planning. She said I was playing with fire and that Mark would be devastated if he found out the real reason I wanted to change the name. She begged me to stick with Noah, but I was stubborn and emotional and convinced that I knew what was best for my baby. I told Sarah that she didn't understand and that the name Bennett just felt perfect for our son. I said Mark would come around once he met the baby and saw how well the name suited him. I called Mark dozens of times that night, but he wouldn't answer his phone. I left voicemails apologizing and trying to explain that I hadn't meant to hurt him, that I loved him and only him, and that the name didn't mean what he thought it meant. But even as I was saying those things, I knew they weren't entirely true. The name did mean something to me. It connected me to Bennett in a way that felt significant and meaningful. I had chosen it because it made me feel close to someone who had once been the most important person in my life. When Mark finally came back to the hospital the next day, he was cold and distant. He held the baby and said all the right things to the nurses and doctors, but he barely looked at me. I could tell that something fundamental had changed between us. He told me that he had spent the night thinking about our relationship and whether he could trust me anymore. He said that naming our son after my ex-boyfriend felt like the ultimate betrayal. Like I had chosen Bennett over him in the most important moment of our lives together. I tried to explain that it wasn't about choosing Bennett over him, that it was just a name and didn't mean I loved Mark any less or wanted to be with anyone else. But Mark said it wasn't just about the name itself. It was about what the name represented. He said that my decision showed that I wasn't fully committed to our marriage and our family. That some part of me was still holding on to my past and my feelings for Bennett. That he couldn't build a life with someone who wasn't completely present and devoted to their relationship. I wanted to argue with him and tell him he was overreacting. But deep down, I knew he was right. I had made an emotional decision based on my feelings for another man. I had prioritized my connection to Bennett over my commitment to Mark, even if I hadn't meant to do it consciously. We brought the baby home and tried to pretend everything was normal. But Mark was different. He was distant and cold, and seemed to be going through the motions of being a husband and father without really being present. He would take care of the baby and help with feedings and diaper changes, but he rarely talked to me directly. When he did speak to me, it was about practical things like schedules and chores. The emotional intimacy that had always been the foundation of our relationship was completely gone. I kept trying to apologize and make things right, but Mark said he needed time to process what had happened, that he couldn't just forgive and forget something that had shaken his trust so completely, that he needed to figure out if our marriage could survive what I had done. Then things got even worse. About a week after we brought the baby home, Mark was going through my phone to find a pediatrician's number, and he accidentally discovered something that made everything 10 times worse. He found a voicemail that I had left for myself a few months earlier when I was feeling emotional and confused. In the voicemail, I was talking about my feelings for Bennett and wondering if I had made the right choice in marrying Mark. I said that sometimes I wondered what my life would have been like if Bennett and I had stayed together. I had completely forgotten about that voicemail. I had left it during a moment of pregnancy-induced emotional chaos when I was feeling overwhelmed and nostalgic. I didn't mean any of the things I said, and I would never have acted on those feelings. But Mark didn't see it that way. To him, the voicemail was proof that I was still in love with Bennett and had been having doubts about our marriage throughout my entire pregnancy, that I had been emotionally cheating on him, even if I hadn't been physically unfaithful. He confronted me about the voicemail, and I tried to explain that it was just hormonal rambling that didn't mean anything. That pregnant women sometimes have weird emotional thoughts that they don't really mean. But Mark said it confirmed everything he had suspected about my feelings. He told me that the problem wasn't just the name, it was that I was still emotionally connected to Bennett and hadn't fully let go of my past, that I couldn't be a good wife and mother while I was still carrying a torch for someone else. I wanted to deny it, but I couldn't. Mark was right. I had never fully gotten over Bennett, even though I thought I had. Some part of me had always wondered what might have been if we had stayed together, and that part of me had influenced my decision to name our son after him. Mark said he couldn't continue living with someone who wasn't fully committed to their marriage, that he deserved better than being someone's second choice or backup plan, that our son deserved to grow up in a home where both parents were completely devoted to each other. He moved out that night and went to stay with his brother. He said he needed space to think about what he wanted to do about our marriage, that he couldn't make any decisions while he was so angry and hurt and confused. I was devastated. In the span of 2 weeks, I had gone from having a happy marriage and a new baby to being a single mother facing the possibility of divorce. All because I had made one emotional decision that I couldn't take back. I tried everything I could think of to win Mark back. I wrote him letters explaining my feelings and apologizing for the pain I had caused. I suggested couples counseling and promised to do whatever it took to rebuild his trust. I even offered to change the baby's name legally, if that would help. But Mark said it was too late for all of that, that the damage had been done and he couldn't unknow what he now knew about my feelings, that he would always wonder if I was really happy with him or if I was secretly wishing I was with someone else. He filed for separation 2 months after the baby was born. He said he wanted joint custody of our son, but couldn't continue being married to someone he couldn't trust, that he needed to protect himself and the baby from any more emotional chaos. The custody battle was brutal. Mark's lawyer painted me as an unstable woman who was obsessed with her ex-boyfriend and couldn't be trusted to make good decisions for her child. They used the name change and the voicemail as evidence that I was emotionally unfit to be a primary caregiver. My lawyer tried to argue that I was a good mother who had made one mistake in judgment, that the name didn't affect my ability to care for my son, and that Mark was being vindictive and unreasonable. But the judge seemed sympathetic to Mark's position. In the end, we were awarded joint custody, with Mark getting primary physical custody. I would have our son every other weekend and one evening per week. It felt like being punished for making an emotional decision during one of the most vulnerable times in my life. Mark also got to keep our house since he could afford the mortgage payments on his own, and I couldn't. I had to move into a small apartment that I could barely afford on my part-time income. The life I had built with Mark was completely gone. The hardest part was seeing how the separation affected our son. He was too young to understand what was happening, but I could tell that the back and forth between houses was confusing for him. He would cry when I dropped him off at Mark's house and seem unsettled for hours after transitions. Mark started dating someone new within 6 months of our separation. A woman from his work who seemed sweet and stable, and everything I apparently wasn't. She was good with our son and never made Mark question her loyalty or commitment. Seeing them together was devastating. They looked happy and normal, and like they had the kind of relationship I had thought Mark and I had. Like they could trust each other completely and build a future together without any baggage from the past. I wondered if Mark had ever really loved me, or if he had just been settling for someone who wasn't his first choice. If maybe he had been looking for an excuse to leave our marriage, and I had just given him the perfect one. But I knew that wasn't fair. Mark had loved me completely and had trusted me with his whole heart. I was the one who had betrayed that trust by holding on to feelings for someone else. I was the one who had destroyed our family with my inability to let go of the past. I started seeing a therapist to try to understand why I had made such a destructive decision. She helped me realize that I had never properly grieved the end of my relationship with Bennett, that I had rushed into marriage with Mark without fully processing my feelings about my first love. She said that naming my son Bennett was my way of trying to hold on to that relationship without admitting to myself what I was doing, that it was a form of emotional cheating that was just as damaging as a physical affair. I began to understand that my feelings for Bennett had been affecting my marriage all along, even when I wasn't conscious of it, that I had been comparing Mark to Bennett and finding him lacking in subtle ways, that I had never been fully present in my relationship with Mark because part of me was still stuck in the past. It was painful to admit, but the therapist was right. I had been emotionally unavailable to Mark without even realizing it. I had loved him, but I had never loved him with my whole heart because I was still carrying feelings for someone else. The divorce was finalized a year after our son was born. Mark got primary custody, and I got visitation rights. We also had to split our savings and retirement accounts, which left me with very little money to start over. I had to find a full-time job to support myself, which meant less time with my son. Mark was understanding about adjusting our custody schedule when I had to work, but it still meant that I saw my child less than I wanted to. 2 years later, I'm still dealing with the consequences of that one decision to change my son's name. I'm still explaining to people why I only have my child part-time and why his father and I aren't together. I'm still trying to rebuild a life that I destroyed with one emotional choice. My son is happy and healthy and loved by both of his parents, but he's growing up in a broken home because I couldn't let go of my past. He'll never have the intact family that Mark and I had planned to give him. Mark married his new girlfriend last year and they're expecting a baby together. My son will have a half-sibling who gets to grow up in the stable, loving home that should have been his. I'm happy that Mark found someone who can love him completely, but it's hard not to feel jealous and regretful. I've tried dating, but it's difficult to explain my situation to new people. How do you tell someone that your marriage ended because you named your baby after your ex-boyfriend? It sounds either crazy or terrible, depending on how you tell it. Most men don't want to deal with that kind of baggage. They see me as someone who couldn't commit fully to her marriage and might do the same thing to them. They're probably right to be cautious. I think about that moment in the hospital constantly, the moment when I decided to change my son's name without discussing it with Mark. If I could go back, would I make a different choice? Would I stick with Noah like we had agreed? I want to say yes, but I'm not sure that's true. I was so deep in my feelings for Bennett at that time that I might have made the same mistake, even knowing the consequences. I was operating on pure emotion, rather than rational thought. That's the most frightening part of this whole experience, realizing that I was capable of making such a destructive decision without even understanding why I was making it. That my unconscious feelings could overpower my conscious commitments so completely. I've learned to be more aware of my emotional patterns and triggers, to recognize when I'm being influenced by feelings that I'm not fully acknowledging, to make decisions based on my values rather than my impulses. But those lessons came too late to save my marriage or keep my family together. Now I'm a single mother living in a small apartment, seeing my son every other weekend, and trying to build a new life from the wreckage of my old one. The irony is that Bennett, the man whose name caused all this destruction, has no idea what happened. He's living his own life with his own family, completely unaware that his memory destroyed mine. The name that felt so important to me meant nothing to him. Sometimes I wonder if I should reach out to Mark and try to explain things better, to tell him that I understand now why what I did was so hurtful and that I'm truly sorry for the pain I caused. But I think it's too late for that kind of conversation. Mark has moved on and built a new life. Reopening old wounds wouldn't benefit anyone, especially our son, who deserves to have parents who can co-parent peacefully. The best thing I can do now is focus on being the best mother I can be during the time I have with him. I still love the name Bennett. When I look at my son, it still feels like the right name for him. But I understand now that feeling right doesn't mean being right. That sometimes our hearts lead us in directions that destroy the things we care about most. I didn't cheat on Mark in the traditional sense. I never touched another man or had an affair. But I betrayed him in a way that was just as damaging. I gave another man space in my heart that should have belonged only to my husband, and I broke everything anyway. My marriage, my family, my son's security, Mark's trust and love and commitment, all because I couldn't let go of a relationship that had ended over a decade ago. The baby's name wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was realizing that I had never been fully present in my marriage, that I had robbed Mark of the complete love and devotion he deserved, that I had cheated us both out of the happiness we could have had together. Now, my son carries a name that represents the destruction of his family. Every time someone says Bennett, I'm reminded of the choice that cost me everything. It's a burden I'll carry for the rest of my life, and one day, it might become a burden for him too. I thought I was following my heart when I changed his name, but I was really following my past, and it led me away from everything good in my present. That's a mistake I'll never make again, but it's also one I can never undo. Do.